derivatives lawyer at Bank of America, and we have been working with Reed Smith on this project. So thanks for having us here today.
Thank you. And finally, Hannah.
Hi everyone, I'm Hannah Saunders. I'm a legal researcher at Queen Mary University in London, specialising in the area of appearance discrimination at work.
Thank you, Hannah. So we're really excited to be here today as part of Face Equality Week. And first and foremost, I just want to say thank you to everybody who's here. This is a really important topic for us. And this is geared towards the facial difference community, because it's incredibly important to understand and apply your rights. So hopefully we can debunk, simplify some of the kind of trickier language around applying your rights today. We're going to start off by showing a short film that we've been pushing out across our social media this week, featuring some of our ambassadors. The theme of Face Equality Week this year is Face Equality is a Human Right. And the people in this video are sharing what that theme means to them. So I'm just going to share my screen now. Bear with me whilst I get this set up. Ooh. Technical difficulties can never be avoided in high stake situations. Can you give me a heads up if you can see the film? Fab.
I believe that every human being has a place in this world. Every race, sexuality, gender, background, age. Therefore, no person should be a victim of any hate or abuse from another person for being their authentic self, or in this case, their appearance.
The physical symptoms of ichthyosis, especially the pain, can be really hard at times, but it's the comments, the stares, the taunts, the laughs, the discrimination that are the hardest things to manage. I've been discriminated against by more taxis than I can remember. They've been scared of my face. I've also been told that they're allowed to refuse my fare if my face makes them scared.
Depression, self-harm, suicide, these are all things that have followed on from these kind of situations.
And often those of us with facial difference are seen to be overreacting or imagining things when we speak about or report microaggressions and discrimination experienced.
Because we are hidden. Most of society does not know about facial differences and does not see it as an issue.
It's still clear to see that hate crime and inequality for those living with a facial difference is still happening every single day. From the school playgrounds to social media, it's still happening and it's near impossible to escape.
Face equality is a human right, and so discrimination against people with facial differences needs to be supported by a human rights framework. We need to be able to report discrimination and hate speech and for it to be taken seriously.
I realise that it might take a while for the world to recognise this. Still, we have to start somewhere, and the more we speak, the louder its echo will reach everybody. A world where we are given equal opportunities, justice, awards and praise without thinking that our face is the thing that will hold us back. A world where we are treated equally.
So I will continue this fight, fueled by the epic love from others and fueled by this epic amount of love that I have for myself.
Thanks everybody for watching that. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen and also let an additional person in. So just welcoming Jonathan as well. Hi Jonathan, welcome.
Hi everybody. Hello.
Hi.
Sorry, I was slightly late. I was just waiting. I think I was just in the link for a bit.
Sorry, I completely missed that. I got caught up in sharing
right.
videos and technical difficulties. Great. So thank you everybody for watching that film. Realise it's very much a very personal take, and hopefully you could hear it okay. So this event comes at a time when we're not just celebrating International Face Equality Week, but also the launch of our new strategic focus as a charity to gather independent recognition for the facial difference community, so that disfigurement is seen as an equality and human rights issue in its own right. It is with thanks to Reed Smith and Bank of America that this research that has shaped today has helped to confirm, validate, and give weight to the experiences that we hear every single day at FEI. We hear that discrimination is rife, underreported, and often does not reach tribunal. The research into the current laws that exist to offer protection to those with disfigurements confirms our understanding that the laws are difficult to understand, with complex terminology that can be arbitrary, with differences between the theory and the practice. When it comes to disfigurement falling under disability law, it's clear the laws can be medical model, functional model of disability focused, without clear definitions of disfigurement and how this extends to facial differences that might not have functional aspects to them, such as scars or birthmarks. And that fundamentally laws are not yet designed to recognise the very unique experiences of the facial difference community and the specific discrimination experienced by those with appearance affecting marks, scars and conditions. So it is this Face Equality Week that we're drawing a line in the sand, taking a rights-based approach as an organisation. And from this point forward, we are channeling our collective energies as a growing alliance of 36 NGOs across the world and a growing community of face equality activists into gathering recognition for this community so that facial difference, face equality is regarded as a human rights issue, and to focus our strategy on positioning face equality as a social justice movement. This might seem aspirational, but it is our belief that the best way to protect and serve this community, this unique community in the long term, is to position face equality alongside, shoulder to shoulder with other equality and human rights issues. The response from the community has been incredible, because we don't need to convince anyone with personal experience of the extent of the discrimination or the need for this neglected issue to be recognised. What we do need is to convince society, to influence policy, and to put a stop to discrimination. And in order to do that, we must gather research into the true extent of this specific issue so that it doesn't get lost in disability laws and spaces. In the short term, we must also strengthen and make use of any disability-related laws that can offer real-time protection to the facial difference community. We must raise awareness of these laws, we must break them down so that they are understandable and accessible, and we must use them as a springboard to improve and implement new policies around the world that can help prevent further discrimination. So for that reason, we're so incredibly grateful to be here today for this session aimed at knowing, understanding and applying the rights of the facial difference community. And we're so appreciative of the team of dedicated volunteers from Reed Smith and Bank of America who've devoted their time to shining a light into this neglected, complicated but vital area of the law. We've been so overwhelmed to see the level of support from across their companies, and we can't thank them enough for helping us to further the global face equality movement. I'm going to hand over to our trustee, Henrietta, for any additional thoughts there.
Thank you so much, Phil. So sort of having been involved with the charity and in the disfigurement space, if I can call it that, for many years, and having worked in advocacy for many years, I'm so aware of the injustice, the discrimination, the unequal opportunities that people face on a daily basis. And as Phil says, we need to draw a line. It's enough. It's not fair that people are not treated fairly. It's not fair that they experience distress, depression, anxiety, suicidal thoughts, just because of how they look. We need to find a way to help people really understand what disfigurement means, what framework we need to be able to give the protection, the representation, the rights that everybody deserves. And to do that, we need to raise awareness, we need to build understanding, we need the policy frameworks, the political frameworks, the corporate frameworks in place. We need to leverage, tighten the legislation in countries all around the world, not just the British legislation, which and the American legislation, which we'll go on to hear about, but wherever people live in the world, they need to be protected so that they don't experience these awful things on a day-to-day basis. I'm going to stop there because I know we've got lots to hear today, but thank you so much for this event. And can I just extend the thanks again from FEI to our corporate partners and to Hannah, who we'll hear from in a bit. Looking forward to hearing what everyone says.
Thank you, Henrietta. So over to the team from Reed Smith.
Thanks so much, Philida, and again, thank you so much for having us here. It's a real pleasure to come and speak to you all about the work that we've been doing. And actually, I think all of our team would say we all found it very, very interesting indeed. And we've learned a lot as going through as well. And I'm sure Jerry would say the same thing. So that's been a real great benefit to us, as well as being able to contribute to this, which is a great thing to work on. So when we started out on this, what we aimed to do was try to create a report with a summary of the protections offered under the legislation to Face Equality International members across different jurisdictions. So the first thing we did was create a very lengthy report, and as lawyers we really enjoyed creating a really lengthy report. There's nothing we like better than a big chunk of legislation, but possibly it was possibly something that we enjoyed, and possibly better for many people to have that in a more digestible form. So that's what we've been working on. We've been just taking us into sort of phase 2 of the project, where we've created some fact sheets with practical questions and answers to questions that people might have. So it's a quick reference guide, and it's by no means, because they're quite short, it's by no means a total chapter and verse on the law, but hopefully they're helpful and they'll give a steer and give people some idea. So we hope they will be helpful. So we had 4 key areas of focus. We've looked at, as we mentioned, the UK Equality Act 2010, the Americans with Disabilities Act 1990, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities of 2007, and the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights of 2000. So we've gone through all of those in terms of creating these sheets and just tried to show what protections they offered. And I think it's fair to say, as well as enjoying doing this, I think it's been really great to work with the Face Equality International people and the team of people at Bank of America. We've really enjoyed it, and I think we're hoping to sort of strengthen that relationship going forward and doing what we can to help and support. Altogether, I think we had 31 lawyers or more across from Dubai, Frankfurt, Hong Kong, Houston, London, New York, Paris, Pittsburgh, that's just getting a very long list, San Francisco and Washington, and lawyers from the Bank of America, including lawyers from the Bank of America from London and New York. So there's been a lot of people have worked on this, and we've put in as much the time that this project deserves, I think. We've identified, I think, some of the themes and gaps in the various pieces of legislation, as I hope will come through from the fact sheets. On the UK Equality Act, if someone meets the definition of disability under the Act, the protections are quite good. And there are also well-established routes for people to enforce their rights in the UK. But the problems lie around the clarity of the definition and who falls within it and who doesn't, and what happens if you don't fall within the definition, or if you don't fall within the recognised category. So that's really where the UK Equality Act perhaps has some gaps that could be worked on. The Americans with Disabilities Act 2010, now that does not require people to identify as disabled to benefit from the protections offered to people. But if you do not identify as disabled, the enforcement possibilities are limited in actual practice. So you know, to a degree, you need to sort of identify as having a disability in order to be able to get things like reasonable accommodations. So there's a bit of a gap there. Looking at the EU Charter, in summary, that does provide guidance and examples to prevent discrimination, and it is legally binding, and it's got to be respected by states that have ratified and signed the Charter. But it doesn't give directly enforceable claims. People must bring a claim against their respective state for violation of the Charter if they haven't actually taken account of it and complied with it. And the final thing we looked at was the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And that's actually pretty good. It does provide a very broad definition of disability and some wide-ranging protections. But you can only benefit from those protections if your country of residence is part of the United Nations and has ratified the optional protocol. And there are many states that haven't, in fact, ratified the optional protocol, and the enforcement provisions are pretty limited in practice. So whilst that might be the best, I think that may be the best piece of legislation that we've looked at, it is somewhat difficult to enforce. So I think that there are the basic blocks in place in many places, but there are gaps, and which need to be looked at, and which in our view need to be filled. So anyway, I think what I'd say in conclusion before we move on to the sort of questions and answers section is that, you know, we really hope they will be helpful going forward to people, the fact sheets that we've done, and it's been such a pleasure working with you guys and with the Bank of America on this. So thank you very much for sending this on to us, and then I'll send back to Phillida to introduce the next section.
Thank you. So we're going to move on now to some practical examples. So we've put together some scenarios that we're going to run through and apply both the UK Equality Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act to these. So looking at some examples of discrimination and how an individual might be able to apply the law. I'm going to share my screen, which should have these case studies on. So bear with me whilst I get that up. Can that be seen? Brilliant. So this is the first case study, so I'll hand over.
Thank you for that. I and Jonathan, I was member of the Reed Smith team, and I will be taking this case over look at the UK Equality Act. I should just also mention before we kind of run through the case study that as Carolyn mentioned, we had a number of individuals in different jurisdictions that have kind of contributed to this project, looking at how the different laws affect people in different jurisdictions. But we haven't necessarily had representative from every jurisdiction to kind of respond to every question. And so if there are any questions about how people might specifically be affected legally in different jurisdictions, we can certainly go and look into those, but we're not really able to give necessarily individual legal advice to people. But obviously by giving an overview of the situation under a few of these pieces of legislation, we can hopefully provide some useful guidance for people. So just to kind of, begin looking at this particular case study. So as you can see, an employee of a facial disfigurement has been overlooked for a promotion in a client-facing public role that would kind of involve representing that company, limited interaction with clients, and in that current role, which has limited interaction, the person feels they may be kept hidden because of their disfigurement, and they have all of the qualifications required for their new role, but ultimately it's given to somebody without a disfigurement. So looking at kind of the UK, where you would sort of look to find that individuals' rights, if they were based in the UK, would be the UK Equality Act, passed in 2010. It sort of incorporates provisions of the Disabilities Discrimination Act, which used to cover this, and you might sometimes hear people refer to DDA, but all of this is now covered by the Equality Act in the UK. In terms of how that person can tell if they're protected under the Act in that situation, well, to enforce the rights under the Equality Act, the individual would need to demonstrate that their facial disfigurement amounted to a disability. And in order to do that, they would need to show that it was a physical or mental impairment that has a substantial and long-term adverse effect on the ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. The effect of facial disfigurement could be anything from limiting that individual's sight to requiring kind of long-term treatment that also impacts on their daily life. And the UK government have also provided some guidance, giving kind of some examples of what may be deemed a disability in that sense. And the guidance note talks about scars, birthmarks, and diseases of the skin, and also recognises that factors like the nature, size, and prominence of a disfigurement that should be considered. So, a very visible and large, for example, disfigurement might, be more likely to be a disability than one that was maybe less noticeable or didn't affect the person sort of in day-to-day way as much. And if a disfigurement is on the face, for example, in this case, as opposed to maybe a less obvious place like the back, it is more likely to be deemed a disability under the Equality Act. And in terms of what section of the Act will be relevant, Part 5, Chapter 1 of the Act contains those rights that are provided to employees, and it prohibits direct disability discrimination in the workplace. And that would actually likely cover this situation, because in this situation, the employee is being treated less favourably due to their disability and being overlooked for a promotion as a result of that, essentially. So now that that arises, you have to look at what steps could be taken by the employee, and this can include making an informal complaint to their employer, discussing the situation with them and explaining why under the UK Equality Act it does constitute direct discrimination, and very important if that's taken, that step to take evidence of the meeting and to make a note of what is said. You could also raise a formal grievance, and if that were the step that was reached, Citizens Device website in the UK has kind of template letters for this process that kind of set out the general templates you'd expect to be used, and ultimately as well, a direct discrimination claim could be brought in the employment tribunal, if other attempts to kind of mediate were not to be successful, or if the person really felt that it was really important to do so to set a precedent of others maybe having the same kind of discrimination against them, then also they could bring that case in the employment tribunal. So there are a number of different steps that could be taken. So that's the first case study under the UK Equality Act. And I'd now like to pass on to the team that will be looking at under the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Thank you. I realised I was supposed to pose questions at you, so I will do that for the next one.
Sure. So under the Americans with Disabilities Act, the first thing you need to look at is how could a person tell if they're protected under the Act for this situation. And here you look at, it's a three-pronged test. The first one is if it substantially limits a major life activity, or you have a history or record of such an impairment, even if it doesn't, even if they don't currently have it. So they have a history or a record of an impairment. And the third one is if it's perceived by others to having a limit to your major life activity. So in this case, as you can see, it is a facial disfigurement, can be an actual disability, because you if you look at the three-pronged test that we just described, having employment is substantially limiting life activity because of your disfigurement. Number two is even if it wasn't kind of seen, because you have a history or a record of it. And number three is it could be perceived as being part of your by your employer, and that will limit what you're able to achieve in employment because of his attitude towards the disfigurement. Now, the Act itself is divided into titles, and this comes under Title I. And George is going to take over and look at how in practice this will impact your rights and how the Act can be applied.
Thanks, Vaibhav. So looking at what section of the Act is relevant, as Vaibhav mentioned, the ADA is split out into 5 sections, and those sections are called titles. So each title prohibits discrimination based on disability in a specific area, and Title I is the relevant title for the employment space. So the general rule sort of within Title I is that an employer can't discriminate against an employee who's qualified for a position on the basis of a disability. And this also specifically picks out and covers the area of job advancement, which would be relevant in this case, where the individual is looking to move into a new role or pursue a promotion. There are some exceptions to that rule which are worth noting. So the general rule doesn't apply to employers with less than 15 employees for each working day in 20 or more calendar weeks of the year, which I know is quite wordy, but it basically involves looking at your employer for each given day of the year and seeing if there are 15 or more employees in work on that given day for 20 weeks of the year. And if the answer is no, then unfortunately the Act won't apply because your employer doesn't employ enough employees to have to abide to this general rule, if that makes sense. The employer rules also don't apply to corporations wholly owned by the US government, unfortunately. They're the ones that are the most sort of worth noting. So moving on from Title I and sort of looking at what steps you can take as an individual. So if this person has missed this opportunity for promotion, they've satisfied the test for disability, which is actually quite easy to satisfy under the ADA because they have this perception of prong. You can look to Title A and see, actually, my employer is covered under Title I and can't do that. They're breaking the general rule. What can you do about that to sort of take some steps and action? So the remedies and rights of enforcement under the ADA are contained within Section 42 of the US Code. That's like the initial starting point and the place to look. If the context or the situation involves employment, which it does in this case, there's an equal employment opportunity commission, which has been created specifically to handle complaints and breaches under the ADA in the area of employment. So you could file a complaint or charge with this commission, and they have a duty to investigate it, and that will be under local or state law. And they have the powers and sort of the ability to conduct these investigations and request information and that kind of thing from employers. If they find that the claim's true, they will try to eliminate it through working with the employer. So educating them and working with them as to why maybe an individual who has a facial disfigurement is qualified and can do this role, and maybe having a facial disfigurement wouldn't impact their success or the company's success in that role. if you do sort of go down that route and make a complaint with the Commission, it's really important to collect all of the details. So what happened, the time, the date, who's involved, what are their positions. Just make sure that you keep a log for yourself all the time, the whole way through of what's happening, so you can refer back to it sort of throughout the process. If you didn't want to pursue sort of an action with the Commission, or if maybe that wasn't successful, or they weren't successful in working through these issues with the employer, they may provide you with a right to sue letter. And that's sort of the next step. If that is unsuccessful, and you could potentially take steps to sue the employer. In addition to that, the Attorney General also has a right to bring a civil action, and that may include an application for an injunction, which would force the employer to alter their behaviour in a specific way. So yeah, handing back to you, Henrietta, to sort of run through the second case study.
Thank you very much. Before we go over to the next case study, I just wanted to allow any opportunity for Hannah to add anything else in there. There was some really solid advice, I'd say, about noting down every step-by-step moment and experience and keeping a track of everything. In the UK, there was talk of the template letters from Citizens Advice. So there was some really solid advice in there. So just anything else that we wanted to add in terms of practical advice for people who are experiencing this stuff.
Sure, thank you, Philida. I guess I would have three kind of things to talk about in terms of practical hints. So when as part of my research, I've spoken to a number of people who have a facial difference, and they've told me about experiences similar to this one that they've had at work, where they've felt that they've been really badly treated and they think it was because of their appearance. But often they say, well, I didn't bring a claim, I didn't go down that legal route. And often there are three reasons for that. So the first one tends to be cost. We're all feeling the squeeze a bit at the moment, and the idea of sending yourself off to a lawyer, that can feel like it's going to get expensive. So that might be a concern. The second worry for people often tends to be, well, I'm sure it was because of my facial difference, but I can't prove it. I haven't got anything in writing. They haven't admitted that was why I didn't get the job. So people worry about being able to prove it in order to bring a claim. And the third worry that they often have is that they're not sure whether they're going to meet those criteria under the Act. Can they definitely be sure that they have a disability, or that they have an impairment which consists of a severe disfigurement, which is then deemed to meet that criteria of disability? So all of those concerns can be bubbling around and can be difficult. And I think what I would say in relation to all of those is that there may be workarounds. So don't necessarily let that put you off taking some advice if you are in this kind of situation, as in the case study. So in terms of cost, there are plenty of free law clinics around that can give you some free advice. And if you Google some, you'll find there are lots of databases that can help you find a law clinic close to where you live, and check whether they would be able to advise on this kind of thing. So don't necessarily assume that it has to be expensive. Go to a law clinic and then they can talk to you about funding options if cost is an issue going forward. So that's not something to necessarily get put off by straight away. The second thing, in terms of how do I prove it? Well, actually, the law has got some mechanisms in it to help with that situation. They're complex, and I'm not going to go into them all today, but suffice to say, you don't necessarily need a smoking gun document that says, I didn't give you the job because of your facial difference. There may be other ways around it. So again, don't let that put you off getting some advice. And thirdly, in relation to, I don't think I've got a severe disfigurement, and I don't think I've got a disability. Again, there are other routes in the law which your advisor might be able to consider. For example, did the other person perceive that you had a severe disfigurement, even if actually it's not severe? Or are there other types of right that might apply in this situation outside of discrimination law. So there are a number of possibilities. So I guess what I would just say in a nutshell is go and get some advice and do it quickly, because there are specific timescales that can apply. And if you leave it, then you may find it's too late to take certain legal routes.
Thank you, everybody. That's been really, really helpful. I'm going to go on to the next case study. So case study 2, someone with a facial difference was told that they weren't allowed to get into a taxi or onto a bus, and that taxi or bus drove away and refused their fare. This is not an isolated incident for this individual, and they have often had taxi and bus drivers refuse to drive them. Over to the team.
Yeah, hi, Phillida. Yeah, so this one, if this were to occur in the UK again, this would be similar to the case study Jonathan ran through. It would be the UK Equality Act that you'd be looking at to rely on. And as Jonathan touched on, that's really the go-to piece of legislation, not just for disability, but for a whole range of discrimination issues. And I think is sort of the same test that Jonathan alluded to in terms of making sure that the individual would need to show that that their facial disfigurement was an impairment that had a substantial and long-term adverse effect on their ability to carry out their day-to-day activities. And as we were alluding to, the severe disfigurement is specifically called out in that act as having a substantial adverse effect on an individual's day-to-day activities. So it's really about meeting that sort of test of severe disfigurement. And as we were saying, this disfigurement can include things like scars and birthmarks, and then the severity, which is sometimes the part that's more open to interpretation. You're really looking at things like the nature, the size of the disfigurement and the prominence. Can you see it only when you're up close with the person, or is it visible from a distance? And as Jonathan was saying as well, the location of it is also relevant. It's worth noting as well that the obligation here is on the claimant to actually prove that the impairment consists of a severe disfigurement. So that's just another point worth bearing in mind. So that's the sort of first sort of test of can you actually rely on the Equality Act for this particular scenario? And then I think there's sort of two, in this particular case study, there's two different circumstances. So the first one is the bus provider, and sort of looking at it from a UK perspective. We sort of say that in most cases the bus providers are a public service. And there's a specific duty under Section 149 of the Equality Act. It's the public sector equality duty, and this applies to public authorities when they're carrying out public functions. And it requires that the public bodies take action to eliminate any conduct that's prohibited under the Equality Act, such as discrimination on grounds of a person's disability. So in terms of the bus scenario, that this sort of discrimination by the bus driver should fall squarely within that sort of public sector equality duty. They also have a duty in the Equality Act to create good relationships between those with disabilities and those that don't have disabilities. So yeah, you'd be for the bus driver here, or for the bus scenario, you'd be looking at Section 149 of the Equality Act, and that public sector equality duty. For the taxi driver, it's slightly different, or it's a slightly different analysis. Now, the taxi driver, I think we'd all agree that it's unfair treatment, but by the taxi driver, but unfair treatment is only deemed to be unlawful discrimination under the Equality Act if it's carried out by certain groups. And so you have to do an additional analysis of well, is this particular group who's sort of inflicted the discrimination, are they included in that act? Now, in this particular case, transport providers such as taxi drivers are specifically included, and so you would be able to, you should be able to rely on. They do have that duty, and they can be held to account for that unfair treatment because they're listed as one of the relevant categories. And then moving on to, I suppose, the practical steps of, well, what would you do in this, or what would the individual do in this situation? I think for the bus driver, again, it's because it's certainly in the UK, it'd be a public company. Your first step would probably be making an informal complaint, and this, I suppose, touches on what Hannah was saying there about, it can be quite daunting to take, formal legal action, but I think an informal complaint is sort of a useful first step because it raises the concern and it raises the issue to the actual company. And you could do this through, for example, their website. Most transport providers would have a sort of contact us section, and you'd raise it and make them aware of it. I think it's important, again, like we were saying in the previous scenario, that you would be taking details of the incident. So you'd get the bus driver's name if he or she was willing to give it to you. If they weren't willing to give it to you, you could, for example, take the registration number off the bus, or the registration plate of the bus, and the service that, the destination as to where it was going and what time it was going there at, so that you could identify the individual driver involved. And then it's, like I said, it's really alerting them through the informal complaint to say, this is an issue. Perhaps the individual or perhaps the whole organization needs training as to how this, to try and avoid this in the future. And then if the informal route is unsuccessful, or you feel that it's sort of, perhaps, if I think we were saying it's a recurring theme with this particular bus company, then you might go down the route of a formal complaint. And you'd start there by sort of trying to ascertain, again, perhaps from the website or by contacting the company directly, whether they have a formal complaints procedure, and pursuing that. And there are templates, again, I think there's some on the Equality Advisory Support Service website where the templates can be found for sort of making those more formal complaints. And again, that's a sort of useful practical step before you sort of have to go to court and sort of get heavily involved in litigation. I think in the situation of the taxi driver, again, it's slightly different. Because it's an individual. Now, it may be the case that he's part of a taxi company, in which case you could follow similar procedures. If they're a well-known taxi firm, you could contact them through their website and raise their concerns and raise sort of a complaint directly to the company. But again, you'd be taking, specific details of the incident. Again, you try and get the driver's name or their taxi registration number. I think all taxi drivers are required to have that these days. Or you take their actual registration plate of the car so that you could identify them. And then if it isn't, if you weren't successful, or you didn't feel that, or if you felt that there was such a recurring issue that you wanted to take things further, then you would sue them under the Equality Act for discrimination, because, as we said, the transportation providers such as taxi drivers would fall within the scope of the Equality Act and the protections that are afforded to individuals from discrimination by such individuals.
Thank you. So I guess over to the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Just before I go on to that, I think I wanted to stress a point on how important it is to have the informal approach as well, because sometimes it's possible that employers or people that you come in contact with do not have an understanding of maybe they don't know where to get the resources from that you need, or maybe they don't have a budget, so they might be too scared to kind of give you a job or do something because everything will come on them. But it's important to have those informal conversations, because maybe then you can explain that actually not everything does come on you. You may have resources that the employer or people can use. So just to say that having those conversations and raising it with something like the commission that Georgia was talking about may give a better understanding of, you know, why things happened, or is there a business need that they feel that you're not able to fulfill. Just for some clarity, that becomes important. Moving on to the Americans with Disabilities Act in this case study, I think the same premise applies here. You need to show that it's substantially, you have an impairment, physical or mental, that substantially limits the major life activity. It's history and record again, and also that you have perceived, that others perceive you as having a disability, even or impairment, even though you may not perceive it yourself. And these three limbs apply again in the sense that they affect your ability to travel and access to transport. And but as Georgia will come on to, it's a different title that comes under this, which is title number 2, I believe. And there is a difference in the two situations, because one is a public company where the act will apply, and the other is a private company where the act may not give you that much of protection. But I'm leaving it to Georgia to explain the detail in that respect.
Thanks, Vaibhav. So again, looking at what section of the Act is relevant, as Vaibhav sort of alluded to, this is split into 2 separate parts depending on the 2 separate scenarios. So for the bus driver or the bus company, as I said earlier, the ADA is split out into 5 sections or titles, and Title 2 is the one that covers accessing government services. So assuming that this bus service that we're talking about is operated by sort of a government entity or government service in the US, this title of the ADA prevents an individual from being excluded from or benefiting from a transportation service due to their disability or perceived disability. So this is also supplemented, just worth noting, it's supplemented by requirements relating to accessibility. So there's quite a lot of things in the ADA that detail specific requirements for public transportation vehicles for those with disabilities. But this sort of contrasts with the taxi driver scenario. So the ADA is actually unclear on this point. So assuming that a taxi driver would be a private entity and not a public transport provider, Title 3 of the ADA would be the relevant section, and that's the services operated by private entities section. And this section gives a very specific list of private entities that are sort of covered under the Act, and taxi drivers are not included in that list. So that would suggest that the ADA doesn't actually provide any protections in this situation. However, protections against this nature of discrimination may be covered under state or local law, so that is worth looking into if you don't sort of find what you're looking for within the ADA. Moving on from that and looking at what steps can be taken by an individual in this situation. Again, for the bus situation, the bus company, remedies and rights to enforcement under the ADA are contained within Section 42 of the US Code. So in this scenario, unlike the previous case study that we had that related to employers, and sort of the employment context, there's not a commission that you can sort of go to and make complaints. again, you could sort of make an informal complaint with the bus provider and go onto their website, as Jerry was sort of talking about before, see if they have a complaints procedure, see if there's a way to contact them, let them know what's happening, keep as detailed a record as you can of the events, try and find out what service you're on, who the bus driver is, maybe even suggest some ways that they could take steps. Could you provide employee training to let your employees know that this is not acceptable behaviour, it's discrimination under the ADA, and yeah, just give as much detail as you can. And as I mentioned previously, the Attorney General also has a right to bring a civil action, and these will be brought in the district court, and they may include an injunction. So even though it would be quite hard to sort of enforce an injunction with the individual drivers, it would set a precedent to let companies know, and let this applies to taxi drivers as well, let individuals know that it's not acceptable to refuse someone and refuse their fare because they have a facial disfigurement. And if you're a taxi driver, you can't just say, no, sorry, I'm allowed to refuse you because your facial difference is uncomfortable for me. That's not okay. So that might be one avenue to go down, but it's sort of an interesting case study because it shows how some things are very clearly protected and other things are very clearly not under the Act, which sort of highlights some of the gaps, I think. But yeah.
Thank you, everybody. Were there any additional thoughts on this one from Hannah or anybody else from the wider team?
Not from me.
I guess in that case, we're going to hand over for questions. So anybody that's watching on the live, please comment with your questions. As has been spoken about already, the team can't offer specific legal advice. But if you throw your question in, we'll do our best to look at the way that the law might be applied. So rather than holding back, just ask, and we'll do our best to try and give some practical information. Don't hold back. In the meantime, I've got a question that arose from something that was said. So there was a public sector duty on the bus driver, and did I hear correct? There was a duty to kind of promote and create positive relationships. So would that extend to passengers? Would that extend to the driver's responsibility? Say an individual with a facial difference was being harassed or abused on a bus, would that be something that the driver would have a duty to prevent? And is this something that you could answer?
It's kind of a tricky question, I suppose. And I'm not sure there's been any specific case law on the point, and I think the case law is pretty scant in terms of how it's been applied. But and I don't know if Hannah, if you have seen anything in your research on this, but I think the sort of point around that public sector duty is that, and maybe it is somewhat aspirational, but it's sort of making the point that they should be promoting the good relations, but it's hard to know without any sort of specific case law, certainly not any that we came across in our research on the point, as to how it would actually work if, I think your question really is does the driver have a duty to police that and be a sort of a referee or to sort of stop that? But yeah, I'm not sure we saw any specific case law on the point in our research.
That's really interesting. Maybe that is something that we could encourage more people to speak up about. Henrietta, you've got your hand raised.
Yeah, so not from the legal perspective, but from the advocacy perspective, in the past, in London, we did quite a lot of work with some of the transport providers in terms of kind of raising awareness, so not down to the individual driver of each train, but certainly, the London Underground and various bus and train lines. We did lots of poster campaigns to just help raise awareness educate people. And I think this was a good use of the third public sector duty of fostering good relations. It was, just helping people feel more comfortable and confident with an issue that they hadn't necessarily seen before. It would be great to have some more case law on that, just to actually kind of give people the confidence in the law. But in terms of raising awareness, I think it was quite useful.
I think the point also is the same thing with aviation, or I think the point applies as well. I mean, if you're on a plane, the captain is responsible for the safety of the passengers and is allowed to kind of do the law as is on the plane. The same thing with the bus driver. I think he is responsible in the sense of he can, if somebody's being harassed and that person, he can, in my view at least, using the same analogy, ask the other person to step off the bus, because he has the responsibility for the safety of the passengers on his bus. So I guess that would apply as well in terms of what he's allowed to do if something like this happens.
Thanks, everybody. We've got a couple of questions that have come in on the live. So does the ADA cover subcontractors? For instance, I work as a performer in the entertainment industry, and I have been asked to cover my face in the past in order to continue working with a company. Are there any protections here?
So I think that that would be one of the things that was covered under the specific private entity section that I was discussing earlier. To be honest, I don't know off the top of my head if that particular situation would be covered, but can definitely tell you where to go to sort of look through that. And let me just have a look through my notes and tell you. So it would be Title 3. And it is quite easily set out within the Act. So if you go to Title 3 and you can Google Title 3, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and it will come up, and it's quite clearly set out. So, and they're generally grouped together. So it will be like restaurants, hotels, sort of like service industry in one. And then in another one, it might be like shops, supermarkets, pharmacies, for example. So that would be, I don't know off the top of my head is the answer, but that would be where you would need to go to look, if that's helpful.
Thank you. There's another question that's come in that might be quite broad, but I wonder whether we could just ask this individual to indicate where they might be in the world. So the question is there any international legislation that protects non-US/GB citizens? Maybe another brief run through of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities might be helpful, whilst we also perhaps ask this person to give an indication of where they might be in case that's helpful.
Yeah, sure. So in the UN Convention, just to give you a sort of broad overview, I think as Carolyn touched on at the top of the call, it does have wide-ranging protections, and whether it be in the workplace, in education, in your sort of cultural life. But I think when I checked, I think by the beginning of May this year, I think 185 countries had ratified the convention itself. So it does, in terms of a global reach, it obviously has a much greater scope compared with these individual pieces of national legislation. I think where you run into issues with the UN Convention is sort of after that point. So it looks great on paper, and it's got all these great aspirational protections. But in reality, the countries that have ratified it actually have to implement it into national law to have any real effect. Now, what you can do is if, let's say you are in, I'll just choose South Africa as a non-US or sorry, maybe I shouldn't choose a specific country, but if you're in a country that has ratified this, has ratified the UN Convention, you can make a complaint to the committee, but in order to do that, they have to have ratified the optional protocol as well. And out of the 185 countries that have ratified the convention, only 100 have actually ratified the optional protocol. So already you have a gap in enforcement. You know, you have the rights there, but you actually can't enforce them. And then even if the country has ratified the optional protocol, then you make a complaint to the committee, but the committee can only make recommendations to the specific state party, so the specific country that's, you know, in violation. But the country, you're reliant upon the country to actually implement those recommendations and to comply with those recommendations. So really, the sort of if the country you live in is not willing to police itself, really, it can simply just ignore those recommendations, and then you're left sort of without any real meaningful recourse, unfortunately.
I would also say, if you're within Europe, you also have the EU Charter. But as Jerry alluded to, for the UN Convention, the similar thing applies. It does have a lot of rights, like the right to work, or even the general discrimination right of Article 21, right to dignity, and all of that is there. But the caveat to all of that is you have to look at your local law, and if your local law does not provide that protection, what you can do is there's a recourse in the EU Charter, but that recourse is to the member state, saying that the local law which the employer or anyone has used, it actually goes against the EU Charter. And so you bring an action against your member state as opposed to the individual per se. But the EU Charter does have rights as well. But as we pointed out, the lack of enforcement is a significant gap even for the EU Charter.
So I guess I would just follow that up and just say that we've now got a fact sheet, thanks to these teams, that's on our website under the resources page that does go through the EU Charter in more detail. And I think the key thing across all of this is keeping a record of what has gone on and using some of the principles of asserting whatever language your state, your country is using in the law to protect people with disabilities, and arming yourself with that. There's one final question, if everybody's happy. So in the US, I am part of an employee resource group with my employer to discuss disabilities in the work and home environment. Where would be a good start if I were looking to advocate outside of my job, because awareness is really lacking? This might be something for Henrietta.
Yes, so a range of stakeholders, aren't there? There's some political kind of targets. You could think about education, so you could think about the local education authority. You might want to go with the health service. So we did lots of advocacy in the health service, kind of improving sort of holistic joined up care for patients and their family. You might want to think about sort of customer service, so retail. We did some very interesting work in the past with I think I'm not going to say the name, a well-known spectacle company who had an unfortunate incident with a customer who had a very noticeable birthmark. Fortunately, the company was very up for developing some training for their staff, and that was very effective. They rolled it out across the shops in the UK. And I suppose the other players are the media. And I know Face Equality International has already done some work with the media. There's not one right answer. I would think in your own country, in your own state, where is there an appetite for change? Where do you sense that you can galvanize some momentum? And I know Phillida and the team are going to be there to be able to be a resource, the sort of how you think through that sort of local campaign, if I can call it that. So definitely get in touch with the team and they can help you with some strategic thinking. I think I'll stop there, Phil, because otherwise I'll probably talk for about 3 hours.
Well, I might just throw in one final question that's come in on the Facebook, which is really good. And this is something that I'd love to know more about as well. So in the FEI report that was just released, there was a case in Florida that was mentioned. Are there more documented cases like this? Are there any documented cases of the ADA actually protecting people with facial differences? In the US, does it often just come down to the individual states? So I guess the question is, where can an individual go and find case law, if at all?
I mean, I think we haven't got any US lawyers on here today, so we probably can't immediately answer that. But I think that there is the commission, I believe, and under the ADA might possibly be able to assist with that.
Brilliant. Maybe that's something that we could investigate as a follow-up and put out something on social media for anybody wondering about that.
Yeah, we did look at the team did look at the case law and have quoted what they believe to be the most relevant ones. So you know, we can't, I guess that there may be things we're not aware of, but those were the cases that we looked at in the longer report are the ones which are the team working on that consider to be the most relevant ones. So
in the UK, would that be a question of going through freedom of information?
Finding out case law, I suppose, possibly not. I think in the UK we would do a legal search for it, I suppose. But someone in a law clinic or somebody like that Hannah mentioned earlier, you know, would be able to do a search and see, you know, and look and see whether there was what the relevant case law was on it. But there hasn't been very much. That's the thing. There hasn't been very much, so that it's difficult to draw conclusions. And there does tend to be more case law in the US, because it's a bigger place. So there do tend to be more cases in the US, but it's in the UK it's quite limited, I think.
What the lawyers with disabilities?
Hannah.
Yeah, I agree with Carolyn. Just to add to that, the employment tribunals do have a website which has a searchable database of case law on it. So in theory, you could put in your keyword and find employment tribunal decisions about it. But that said, it's a bit fiddly and it's not great. So I agree that, you know, if you're heading down that line, perhaps heading off to a law clinic and getting them to have a look for you in the UK might be the best option.
Thank you. Well, we've gone way over time, but that was incredibly helpful to have that section with some practical questions and answers. And if anybody wants to write any additional questions on the Facebook Live, we'll do our best to follow up and point you in the right direction. But just a massive, massive thank you to those watching in and to the team at Reed Smith and Bank of America. I think above all else, what this has gone to show is the importance of speaking up and the importance of self-advocacy and realizing it can be incredibly difficult and it can be complex, but we will do our best to put the resources out there to try and make this that little bit easier, recognizing that there are gaps, and we are committed to trying to prevent any further gaps in the law and advocate for greater protection for the facial difference community in the future. So once again, a massive thank you for working with us on this, and yeah, we're incredibly grateful, so thank you. Okay, all right.
Thanks very much.
Enjoy the rest of Face Equality Week, everybody.
Thank you for your efforts.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye.
Very much.
Thank you.
Everybody.